Not 3 hours, not a weekend, just 3 minutes to decide whether to walk away or step into something that could break you or save you. Grace Holden was a woman with nothing left but a suitcase, a recipe notebook, and the quiet kind of strength that only comes from surviving too much. Nathan Whitmore was the man with everything: status, legacy, and a wedding he couldn't escape. When their paths collided in a Boston hotel lobby, one desperate plea turned into an unbelievable request: pretend to be my girlfriend just for 3 minutes. But what started as a favor spiraled into a life neither of them could predict. If you were her, would you say yes? If you were him, would you dare to hope it could be real? This isn't just a love story. It's a story about truth, about pretending until the pretending feels real, and about the moments that define who we become when no one's watching. Join us on this quiet, powerful journey where love begins not with forever, but with 3 minutes. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel to follow the full story. Let's begin. She came to Boston to start over. He was running from everything he was meant to be. Grace Holden hadn't planned on stepping into a mess, but life, it seemed, had grown fond of catching her off guard. It was a gray Tuesday afternoon in late October, the kind where the clouds hung low and the wind carried a chill that slipped through coats like it had a grudge. Grace stood outside the Bellhurst Grand Hotel, one hand clutching the frayed handle of her suitcase, the other tucking a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. Her boots were damp, her coat was a size too big, and her eyes, soft brown and rimmed with tiredness, held the look of someone who had run out of backup plans. Boston was supposed to be a new beginning, a second chance. A city far enough from the ruins of Portland, from the failed restaurant, the silent apartment, and the father whose voice still echoed in her memory when she stirred tomato sauce. She took a breath, adjusted the strap of her worn satchel, and pushed open the glass door. The hotel lobby was warm, glowing with amber light, marble floors, brass fixtures, the faint scent of eucalyptus and money. Grace stepped inside, trying not to look like someone who had just survived a 7-hour bus ride and was carrying her life in a suitcase held together with duct tape. And that's when it happened. A blur of navy blue suit and panic came charging around the corner. Grace barely had time to register the movement before it slammed into her hard. Her suitcase spun out of her grip, tumbling to the ground with a dramatic clatter, the zipper giving way and spilling half her belongings across the polished floor. She gasped, off balance, and would have fallen if not for the strong arms that caught her mid-fall. "I'm so sorry, are you okay?" the man said, his voice smooth but breathless, tinged with something unmistakably urgent. Grace blinked up into pale green eyes, framed by a face too chiseled to belong in real life. His blonde hair was slightly tousled, his dress shirt open at the collar, the tie pulled loose like he'd ripped it off in frustration. The scent of cedar and something clean lingered between them. She stammered, caught between confusion and the weight of his hand still at her back. Then, just as suddenly, he pulled away. "Are you Grace Holden?" he asked, scanning her face with frantic hope, as though she might be the answer to a prayer he hadn't expected to be heard. "What? Who? How do you know my name?" she asked, trying to gather herself. He didn't answer. Instead, he looked past her toward the grand entrance and swore under his breath. "Please, he said, turning back to her. I need you to pretend to be my girlfriend for just 3 minutes. Grace stared at him. I'm sorry, but I'll pay you, he added, his voice low, desperate. Just stand next to me, hold my hand, and smile like you mean it. Why would I? My mother just walked in, he said, glancing again toward the door. If she sees me alone, she'll drag me back to that wedding like I'm livestock. Please, just go with it. Grace followed his gaze. A tall woman in her late 60s stood near the revolving door, dressed in ivory silk. Her white blonde hair pulled into a tight bun. Her posture was regal, her gaze calculated, cold. Grace hesitated. Her clothes were scattered on the floor. She was running late for a job interview. Her life was a half-packed suitcase of uncertainty. And yet, something about the man's expression, a mixture of fear and fatigue, hit her in a place she hadn't felt in a long time. She nodded. 3 minutes, she said. He exhaled in relief, reached down, and clasped her hand gently, guiding her toward the woman. His grip was warm, steady. Mother, he said with a practiced smile. This is Grace, my girlfriend. The older woman raised one eyebrow in polite surprise. Well, that's unexpected. Grace smiled, too aware of the damp hem of her jeans and the plastic spoon poking out of her pocket. Yes, Nathan said. We met last spring. Farmer's market in Cambridge. She was buying heirloom tomatoes. I was hopelessly out of season. Charming, the woman replied, eyes narrowing slightly. I trust we'll see you both at dinner tonight. Grace opened her mouth to protest, but Nathan squeezed her hand. Wouldn't miss it, he said. Margaret gave one last glance at Grace's scuffed boots, then turned and walked away, her heels tapping rhythmically against the marble. As soon as she was out of earshot, Grace pulled her hand away. What the hell just happened? Nathan laughed, running a hand through his hair. You saved me from what would have been the longest day of my life. Grace crossed her arms. Who are you? Nathan Whitmore? He said, extending a hand sheepishly. Of the Whitmore estate, Whitmore Charities. And unfortunately, the Whitmore wedding that's supposed to be happening today. You're the groom. Was, he corrected, or was supposed to be. Grace blinked. Did you just fake an entire relationship to get out of your own wedding? Nathan shrugged. Desperate times. You're insane. Maybe, he said. But you're the one who said yes. They looked at each other for a moment, not quite laughing, not quite strangers anymore. And somewhere in Grace's chest, something shifted just slightly. A tickle of curiosity, the first spark of something not yet named. 3 minutes were all it took to rewrite everything Grace thought she came to Boston for. Nathan led her away from the lobby, weaving through tall floral arrangements and polished furniture like a man who knew every escape route. When they finally reached a quiet corner by the concierge desk, he exhaled, resting one hand on the marble ledge and the other still hovering near his chest, like his heart hadn't quite caught up. Grace, meanwhile, knelt back down and began scooping up her scattered belongings scarves, a chipped mug wrapped in socks, a folded paper with a smudged address. Sorry about the mess, she muttered, stuffing everything back into the suitcase with as much dignity as she could gather. Nathan crouched down beside her, picked up a runaway bottle of rosemary oil, and handed it to her. Nice scent, he said softly. You a chef? She looked at him, surprised. Yes? Or trying to be. He nodded. That explains the rolling pin sticking out of your backpack. They shared a small, weary laugh. When everything was packed, or at least resembled being packed, Grace zipped the case closed and stood. Her shoulders dropped. Her eyes locked with his again. So, she said, brushing dust from her knees. Are we done? Is your wedding properly avoided now? Nathan hesitated. It's more complicated than that. Grace raised a brow. Look, he said, adjusting his cuffs, clearly stalling. That woman, my mother, she's not the type to believe in accidents. You don't say. She'll ask questions. She'll look into you, into us. She'll start peeling at the story until she finds something she can sink her claws into. Grace crossed her arms. That sounds like a you problem. I know, he admitted, but it became a we problem the moment you smiled at her and said, nice to meet you. She sighed. Nathan looked down, then back up at her with surprising vulnerability. I need a little more than 3 minutes. She blinked. Just 2 weeks. He added quickly, pretend we're together, just until I can untangle myself from the arrangement. What arrangement? He exhaled. The wedding wasn't about love. It was a business deal. A merger disguised in white lace and champagne flutes. My mother's doing. Grace's eyes narrowed. So you agreed to marry someone just for a business deal? It was never supposed to happen, he said, quietly. I thought I could back out before it got real. But then real came fast. And today, I ran. Grace stepped back. Nathan, this is insane. I don't know you. You don't know me. I'm not an actress. I came here for a job, not to play pretend in some billionaire soap opera. I know how it sounds, he said, but I saw you before we even spoke. Standing outside, you looked like someone who didn't have time for anyone's nonsense. And when you agreed, even for a moment, it felt like the first real thing I've had in months. That stopped her. For a second, the world quieted around them. The hum of suitcases, the click of heels on tile, the ding of elevators all faded into a background Grace couldn't hear anymore. What exactly are you asking? She finally asked. A story, Nathan said. A believable one. Just for a short time. Are you paying me? Yes. $5,000. Plus housing. If you need it. Grace stared at him. Her heart thudded, unsteady. She hadn't had more than $200 in her bank account since July. You don't seem like the desperate type, she said quietly. But today, you did? Nathan's face shifted, something raw passed across it. If this story falls apart, it's not just me who loses. It's my staff, the chefs, the servers, the farmers we buy from. My restaurant is on the edge. And my mother knows it. She's using that. If I lose this, it won't be clean. Grace didn't speak for a long time. She just stood there, her hand still clinging to the suitcase that had dragged across states and heartbreak. Then she nodded once. Rules, she said. We set boundaries. No weird touchy stuff. No sharing anything real unless absolutely necessary. You tell me every detail about our fake life together so I don't look like a fool. Deal, he said, without hesitation. And one more thing. What if I'm going to be your girlfriend? I'll need coffee. Good coffee. He smiled. I know a place. They stood there for another beat, both stunned by what had just transpired. Then he lifted her suitcase gingerly and gestured toward the door. The car's waiting, he said. She gave him a skeptical look. I wasn't lying about the money, he added. I wasn't worried about the money, she replied. I was wondering if your car has room for this suitcase. It has personality. Nathan grinned. Then it'll fit right in. They walked out together into the cold Boston air. Two strangers with a deal, a suitcase full of dreams, and a story that hadn't yet been written. But it would be. And it would be anything but ordinary. They wrote a love story that never happened and started feeling everything they weren't supposed to. The coffee shop Nathan brought her to was tucked between an antique bookstore and a dry cleaner, with ivy crawling up the brick exterior and a faded wooden sign that read, Linden and Brew. Inside, the place smelled of roasted beans, old paper, and something that reminded Grace of Sunday mornings, slow, warm, uncomplicated. This doesn't look like where billionaires get their caffeine, she said as they slid into a booth near the window. Nathan shrugged. I come here when I want to feel human. A barista with a kind smile and lavender tattoos brought over 2 cups black coffee for her, a latte with cinnamon for him. Nathan handed Grace a worn leather notebook and 2 pens. What's this? She asked. Our history, he said. We need a backstory. Grace blinked. You mean, like, a fake timeline? Yes, if we're going to pull this off, we need to remember the same first date, the same weekend trip, the same ridiculous fight over pineapple on pizza. She rolled her eyes, but opened the notebook anyway. The pages smelled faintly of cedar and ink. All right. Where did we meet? Nathan thought for a second. Farmer's Market. Grace gave him a look. That's what you told your mother. Then let's stick with it. Fine. Cambridge Farmer's Market. I was buying heirloom tomatoes. You were lost, looking for strawberries in October, which is when I bumped into you and knocked over your basket. She raised an eyebrow. You knocked over my tomatoes. Sounds like a terrible start. But I bought you coffee to apologize, and I let you rant about the price of organic basil. Grace laughed. Now that sounds like me. They kept going. First date. A small Italian bistro where the risotto was undercooked, and they laughed so hard they cried. First weekend trip. A cabin in Vermont that turned out to have no heat. They ended up wrapped in blankets, drinking bad wine and talking until morning. First argument. She accused him of rearranging her spice rack. He said her playlists made him sleepy. By the time they reached the favorite shared meal section, they were both leaning in close, elbows brushing, the coffee long forgotten. What's your favorite comfort food? He asked. Grace didn't hesitate. Grilled cheese and tomato soup. The kind my dad used to make. With too much pepper. Nathan nodded slowly. Mine's mac and cheese. With ketchup. She recoiled. You monster. He chuckled. Told you we had our first fight. Grace shook her head, scribbling it down. If you ever do that in front of me, we're done. Their laughter quieted into something softer. Outside, the sky had gone from gray to gold. Inside, the buzz of conversations and clinks of ceramic cups felt distant, like background music, to something more real unfolding at their table. Grace closed the notebook. This is weird. Nathan tilted his head. Weird how I feel like I'm remembering things that didn't happen. But I feel them anyway. He didn't answer right away. Just looked at her with that calm, unreadable gaze of his. Then he said, "Maybe we're borrowing the best parts of lives we haven't lived yet." The next few days blurred into one long rehearsal. They met at parks, walked through museums, sat on park benches recounting their fake first winter together. Nathan was a surprisingly good listener. He remembered every made-up detail, every invented memory. One evening, they practiced cooking together in his kitchen. It was sleek and modern, with polished stone counters and a wine fridge he didn't dare touch. Grace wore an apron that said, "Don't talk to me. I'm stirring." Nathan chopped vegetables while she stirred a pot of lentil stew that smelled like fall and home. "You're comfortable here," he said, watching her move. She shrugged. Cooking is the only thing that still makes sense, even when nothing else does, especially then. He didn't press. Instead, he handed her a spoon. She tasted, adjusted the salt, and looked over at him. "Not bad. Whitmore, you might survive in the real world after all. I'll take that as high praise." Later that night, they sat on his balcony, wrapped in separate blankets, staring at the city lights. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the kind that felt earned. "Nathan," she said quietly. "Why me?" He didn't pretend not to know what she meant. "I saw you drop your suitcase, and you didn't scream. You didn't panic. You just started picking things up." She frowned. "So I'm functional. You were calm when everything was chaos. And real. I needed someone real." That night, Grace lay in the guest bedroom of his apartment, staring at the ceiling. The sheets smelled like lavender. The lamp hummed softly. And in her mind, she replayed every fake date they had rehearsed, every made-up smile, every imaginary kiss, and wondered why it all felt so real. When you sit across from someone who knows how to see through lies, even your truths start to feel suspicious. The invitation arrived in the form of a handwritten note, cream-colored stationery, heavy in the hand, with ink that looked like it had been poured from a fountain pen carved from judgment itself. "Grace, join me for tea tomorrow. 2 p.m. at Whitmore Hall. Margaret Whitmore." No please. No explanation. No smiley face or signature curl at the end of the sentence. Just a command dressed up as a request. Grace stared at it for a full minute before turning to Nathan. "Is this normal?" He sighed. For her, that's practically a love letter. "I don't suppose ignoring it is an option." Not unless you want her showing up at your future fake birthday party with a lie detector and a list of say-t questions. Grace folded the note carefully, her stomach already coiling with something that tasted like regret and rosemary. Whitmore Hall was exactly what it sounded like: grand, historic, intimidating. The kind of place where chandeliers didn't twinkle. They loomed. Every piece of furniture seemed older than most living relatives, and the walls wore oil paintings like armor. Grace was escorted into a drawing room that smelled of leather and bergamot. Margaret was already seated by a window, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups without so much as a glance up. "Miss Holden," she said, finally looking. "Punctuality is a virtue." Grace sat down slowly. "So is directness. So let's be—" Margaret lifted an eyebrow, but offered a faint smile. "Very well." For a moment, the only sounds were the soft clink of silver spoons and the ticking of a grandfather clock that probably witnessed the Civil War. Margaret took a sip. then looked at Grace with the precision of a surgeon about to make the first incision. So, you're the woman who's managed to soften Nathan. Grace smiled politely. I suppose that depends on how hard he was before. Margaret's expression didn't change. He's always been soft in the wrong places. Easy to manipulate, difficult to direct. Until recently. That is, now he's unpredictable. Emotional. That's new. Grace said nothing, letting the silence do the talking. Margaret, of course, filled it. I imagine it takes a certain type of woman to create this kind of distraction. A very specific blend. A chef's instinct. Grace replied, coolly. Balance, seasoning, and timing. Margaret's smile turned blade thin. And what exactly drew you to Nathan? The question felt rehearsed, loaded, like a courtroom inquiry in a teacup. Grace hesitated only a second. The way he listens, she said. Most people hear to respond. He hears to understand. It's unnerving at first, then comforting. Margaret blinked, just once, but it was enough to register. That answer hadn't been in any script. And you believe you can keep up with the demands of his world, she asked, folding her napkin precisely. Grace's jaw tightened slightly. I don't plan to keep up. I plan to bring something new to it. Margaret nodded slowly, then leaned back in her chair. Tell me about your family. Grace felt her breath hitch, not out of fear, but from the weight of the sudden shift. My parents divorced when I was 12. She began. Mom moved to Arizona. I stayed with my dad. He ran a diner until cancer took him. Margaret watched her closely. I see, she said. Do you? Grace asked, not unkindly. I see a woman who's had to build everything with her own hands. Margaret replied, that creates strength, but also desperation. Grace's eyes flicked up. And you think I'm desperate? Margaret didn't blink. Aren't you, Grace considered the question longer than she wanted to. Then she nodded. Slowly. Yes, but not for money. Or status. Or even Nathan, if I'm being honest. Then what? Peace, Grace said simply. I'm desperate for something that doesn't break under pressure. Something that doesn't ask me to pretend to be someone I'm not. The silence that followed was different. Not tense, not warm. Something in between, like the hush before a storm, or after one. Margaret stood. Thank you for the tea, Grace said, rising as well. Margaret didn't offer her hand, but she gave a short nod. One piece of advice. Miss Holden, she said, her voice calm. This family doesn't suffer fools or fakes for long. If you're either, I suggest you take the nearest exit while it's still available. Grace didn't flinch. And if I'm neither, Margaret smiled. Barely. Then I suppose you'll be seeing me again. Nathan was pacing the kitchen when Grace returned. He looked up the moment she walked in. Well, he asked. Grace dropped her purse on the counter, poured herself a glass of water, and leaned against the fridge. She knows. He blinked. Knows what? That I'm not the type of woman who fits. Nathan stepped forward, and Grace sipped her water. And that's exactly why I'm staying. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Not as co-conspirators, not as strangers with a contract, but as two people who had no idea where this thing was going. And maybe didn't want to know. Not yet. Some roles are harder to leave behind when they start feeling like home. It was just past midnight when Grace found herself staring at the city skyline through the large window in Nathan's living room. The lights of Boston blinked like quiet promises, and in her hands was the worn leather notebook they had been filling with memories that weren't theirs. She didn't know why she brought it out again. Maybe it was to remind herself that it was still a game, still a lie, wrapped in sweet, comforting fiction. Or maybe it was to remind herself how good they had gotten at pretending. Nathan walked in barefoot, holding 2 mugs of chamomile tea. He handed her one without a word and sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them to keep the air honest. "She's going to keep testing us," Grace said. "Finally." "She always does," Nathan replied. "It's how she controls the narrative." Grace stared down into her cup. "What if I don't want to be part of the narrative anymore?" He looked over at her. Really looked. "Do you want out?" Silence stretched between them, not heavy, but not light either. "I don't know," she whispered. "I came here for a job, not this, and yet I haven't felt this awake in a long time." Nathan didn't respond right away. He just nodded, as if he knew there were no easy answers. Then he reached into the side table and pulled out a small envelope. "This," he said, sliding it across to her, "is the next part of the proposal." Grace narrowed her eyes. Another envelope. "You rich people really do love your paperwork." He gave a short laugh. "It's not a contract. It's a list." Grace opened it. Inside was a simple itinerary. Events, dinners, public appearances, charity galas. Each date had 2 columns, expected attire and talking points. She let out a low whistle. "So I'm now your full-time fake fiancé, not fiancé." He corrected quickly. "Girlfriend. I wouldn't do that to you." She glanced at him over the rim of her cup. "You mean yet?" He hesitated. Grace put the paper down. "Nathan, what is this really about? Your mom, the restaurant, or something else?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "It's about keeping my world from collapsing. But it's also about you." Grace blinked. "Me, you walked into that hotel lobby with your life falling apart and still found the grace, no pun intended, to help a complete stranger. You stood up to my mother without blinking. And you've turned this ridiculous script into something that actually feels—" He trailed off, struggling to find the word. "Believable," she offered. He shook his head. "Safe." That one word pierced deeper than she expected. "I don't want to manipulate you," he said, softer now, "but I'm asking you to stay in the story just a little longer, until the last page is written." Grace stood, walked over to the kitchen, poured out the rest of her tea. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the pressure of choosing. "Nathan," she said over her shoulder, "I need you to understand something." He stood too, waiting. "I've been broke before. I've been lost. I've made deals I regretted just to survive. But this is different. Because it feels like I'm selling a part of myself I just got back." "I don't want you to lose yourself," he said quietly. She turned around. "Then why do I feel like I already have?" He crossed the room, stopped just shy of touching her. "Because the lines are getting blurry. I know that. I feel it too." Grace took a deep breath. "We need boundaries, rules, no late-night wine-fueled confessions. No glances that last too long. No stealing your playlists." She smiled faintly. "Only if you admit they're better than yours." He smiled back, but his eyes were serious. "Grace, I promise. This doesn't end in disaster. I won't let it. You can't promise that, she said. But I'll stay. For now. He nodded. Thank you. But, she added, holding up a finger, if your mother tries to quiz me again, I reserve the right to fake a fainting spell. Noted. She stepped past him, paused at the door. And if I'm going to keep pretending to love you in public, you better pretend to start liking my cooking in private. He laughed as she disappeared down the hallway. But long after she was gone, Nathan stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the list she'd left behind. Events, dinners, talking points. He didn't need a script for what he felt. He only hoped it wouldn't betray him first. The moment pretending starts to feel like the truth, everything else begins to unravel. Grace didn't expect the guest bedroom to feel so quiet. It wasn't silence in the uncomfortable way. It was a soft hush, like a room holding its breath. The kind you get in places where nothing bad has happened yet, but where memories are just waiting to be made. She had unpacked only the essentials: 2 sets of clothes, her worn notebook, a chipped ceramic spoon, rest-shaped like a cat, and a picture of her father taped to the inside of the closet door. She didn't plan to stay long. And yet, the toothbrush in the shared bathroom, the extra hoodie folded beside Nathan's on the coat rack, it all made the temporary arrangement feel dangerously permanent every morning. She woke before him. She'd quietly move through the kitchen, starting the coffee. She liked the quiet hum of the apartment, the creak of the wooden floor beneath her heels. Nathan would stumble in, hair tousled, shirt half-buttoned, offering a sleepy smile and a murmured, "Is that cinnamon I smell? Or is that just wishful thinking?" One morning, he surprised her with scrambled eggs, slightly overcooked, too much salt. "I Googled breakfast for someone you like but can't tell them yet," he said. Grace smirked. "You should sue the search engine." He grinned, and something in her chest did a somersault. They began to fall into routines without meaning to. Tuesday nights became leftover night. Whatever was in the fridge turned into makeshift pasta or awkwardly folded quesadillas. Thursday mornings, they fought over whose turn it was to restock the oat milk. Sundays, they walked through the city's historic district under scarves and half-joking arguments about which house had the best ghost story vibes. And then there were the touches. Not intimate. Not yet. But present. A hand on her lower back when guiding her through a crowd. Fingers brushing hers when passing a dish. His knee resting just a little too close to hers during a charity gala. Grace noticed all of it. Worse, she didn't mind any of it. The trouble was, the lines had started to dissolve. Not all at once, but like sugar slowly stirred into tea until the whole thing was sweet. And you couldn't tell where the flavor had come from. One Thursday evening, Nathan came home late. His coat was soaked through, hair clinging to his forehead. He looked tired, not physically, soul tired. Grace stood in the kitchen in her worn sweatshirt and mismatched socks, stirring a pot of tomato bisque. She didn't say anything at first, just handed him a towel and pointed to the chair. He sat down, exhaled hard. "Tough day?" she asked. "Margaret called 3 board members today. Tried to scare them into withdrawing support." Grace handed him a bowl of soup and a grilled cheese sandwich with the crust cut off just the way he liked it, though he never told her that. She's scared, Grace said. People only tighten their grip when they feel power slipping. Nathan looked up at her, eyes tired, but searching. How do you always know what to say? I don't, she said, sitting across from him. I just say what I'd want someone to say to me. They ate in silence for a few minutes, the kind of silence that felt like companionship, not absence. When the dishes were done and the lights turned low, they found themselves in the living room, flipping through old vinyl records. Grace pulled out a dusty cover. Fleetwood Mac, she asked. Nathan smirked. My mom hates them. Too emotional. Grace laughed. Drop the needle. As Landslide played, soft and haunting, they both sat back on the couch, not touching, not speaking, just listening. When the song ended, Nathan turned to her. Can I ask you something? Grace nodded. If we weren't pretending, would this feel the same? She met his gaze. Honest, vulnerable. I don't know, she whispered. But sometimes I forget we are. He leaned closer, not to kiss, but to just exist in the same space as her. A breath between them. A question unspoken. Grace didn't pull away. She didn't move forward either. That was the moment she knew. This wasn't acting anymore. And she wasn't sure if she wanted to stop. When the truth knocks on your door, it rarely waits for an invitation. It started with a note. A small white envelope slipped under the apartment door. No name, no return address, just a heavy piece of cardstock inside, engraved in gold. You're invited. Tomorrow, 3 p.m. Whitmore Gallery Monet Room. No signature, no explanation, but they both knew who it was from. Margaret didn't play games. She played finales. Nathan sat at the kitchen table, the note in one hand, his knuckles white. She found something, he said, or she's about to. Grace sat across from him, her eyes steady. Then maybe it's time we stop hiding. Nathan shook his head. She won't just expose us. She'll destroy everything, my reputation. The restaurant, your name. She'll make it all look like a scam. Grace folded her arms. Then let her talk. I'm tired of holding my breath. The Monet room was all light and glass and polite tension. Tall windows spilled daylight over pale carpeting, and the walls were lined with delicate pastel renderings of French gardens and distant fog. But the only storm in the room sat at the far end of a mahogany table. Margaret Whitmore, in a pale gray suit, flanked by 2 lawyers and a folder thicker than a winter scarf. She didn't rise when they entered. Grace sat down calmly. Nathan followed, visibly tense. Margaret placed the folder on the table and opened it. Let's not waste time, she said. I've hired a private investigator. Nathan stiffened. Margaret continued. What he found was illuminating. She slid several documents across the table. Photos, hotel receipts, flight logs, social media timelines that didn't align. Grace didn't flinch. You arrived in Boston the day Nathan met you, Margaret said, voice low and precise. You had no known ties, no shared past, no digital footprints together, not even a mutual friend. That's not a romance. That's a fabrication. Grace leaned forward, folding her hands. You went digging for a lie, and you found one. Congratulations. Margaret blinked, but only once. So you admit it. I admit I didn't meet your son in some storybook way. I admit it started with a favor and a contract. But what you're missing, she said, her voice rising just slightly. Is that somewhere along the way? The act stopped being an act. Margaret stared, unreadable. You think a handful of dinners and well-rehearsed glances make this real, Najera, Grace said. But showing up every day when no one's watching, caring even when it's inconvenient, that's not in any script. The room was silent except for the quiet hum of air through the vents. Then Nathan stood. I should have told you the truth sooner, he said. But I was afraid. You've always controlled everything, my career, my future, who I was allowed to love. Margaret's jaw tightened. I protected the family. No, he said. You protected the image, the illusion. You raised me to be polished, not present. And I'm done pretending. One of the lawyers cleared his throat. Mrs. Whitmore, if I may. She held up a hand, silencing him. Then she looked at Grace again. Do you love him? Grace's mouth went dry. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because the room had suddenly become too still, too quiet, like the moment before a glass shatters. Yes, she said softly. And I think that's the most terrifying part. Margaret stood. For your sake, she said, gathering her papers. I hope that's true. Then she turned and walked away, her heels sharp against the floor, the lawyers scurrying behind like well-trained shadows. Back at the apartment, Nathan poured himself a drink. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, her hands shaking for the first time since the meeting. She's going to retaliate, he said. Pull funding, call the press, maybe sue. I don't care, Grace said. He looked at her, surprised. I've been broke before, she continued, but I've never had something worth fighting for. He set the glass down, walked over, sat beside her. No more pretending, he said. No more, she echoed. But they didn't kiss. They didn't even touch. Because sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is sit beside someone and say nothing at all. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is stay, even when every part of you is begging to run. The apartment was unusually quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet Grace had come to appreciate, but the heavy, oppressive kind. The kind that follows a storm where everything is still standing. But you're not quite sure what's been lost. Nathan hadn't said much since the gallery meeting. He'd taken a call from his restaurant manager, spoken in clipped, measured tones, and then disappeared into his study. Grace sat alone at the kitchen counter, stirring a lukewarm cup of tea. She didn't drink it. She wasn't even sure why she made it. Maybe she needed something to hold on to. Maybe she needed a distraction from the fact that her world, the one she had borrowed, was beginning to slip. Margaret had gone silent. No press, no lawyers, no threats. And that scared Grace more than anything else. Because silence, from a woman like Margaret, was never a surrender. It was a setup. When Nathan finally reappeared, he looked tired, not just physically. His suit jacket hung over one shoulder. His shirt was wrinkled, his tie undone. He looked like a man carrying more than he knew how to hold. She pulled out her steak, he said. Grace's heart dipped. From the restaurant, he nodded. 30%. Gone. Overnight. That leaves us vulnerable. I have to buy out or find another investor within 2 weeks. Or... He trailed off. She didn't need him to finish. Or the restaurant his dream would crumble. I'm sorry, she said, quietly. He looked at her, And for a second, she saw at the crack beneath the charm. The boy behind the billionaire. Scared, exhausted, but still standing. I did this, he said. I dragged you into it. I asked you to lie. And now it's all falling apart. Grace stood up, walked over, rested her hand lightly on his chest. No, she said. You asked me to pretend? I chose to stay. Nathan closed his eyes. Why? The question was too big, too complicated. Why stay when it hurts? Why love someone when the world says you shouldn't? Why fight for a life that was never supposed to be yours? But Grace didn't answer those questions. She asked a different one. What do we do now? Nathan looked at her, slowly, as if weighing her, measuring whether she was still part of this. I have an idea, he said, but it's risky. Worse than lying to Boston's elite and getting exposed by your mother. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The next day, they called a press conference. Grace didn't want cameras. She didn't want microphones. But Nathan insisted, if we don't tell our story, she'll write it for us. So they stood together on the small stage at the front of his restaurant, hands intertwined, eyes steady. Nathan went first. He talked about pressure, about legacy, about the crushing weight of doing everything right and ending up with nothing real. Then Grace stepped forward. She told the truth, that it started with a lie, that it was messy, unorthodox, even foolish. But, she said, voice clear and unwavering, somewhere in that lie, I found something more honest than I ever expected. The room was silent. One reporter raised his hand. Are you still together? Grace looked at Nathan. He looked at her. And without hesitating, he said, yes, but now we're writing a different story. That night, they sat on the fire escape of his apartment, a bottle of cheap wine between them, wrapped in old blankets. The city stretched out below like a glittering promise. You didn't have to stay, he said softly. Grace leaned against his shoulder. Neither did you. He looked at her then, really looked. I want to build something real, not just for the cameras, for us, a real life, even if we have to start over. She smiled. Then let's start over. Nathan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a napkin scribbled with a new idea for a restaurant. No investors, no press, just food, honesty, and a place where nobody had to pretend. He handed it to her. Co-owner, he asked. Grace took the napkin, folded it gently, and said, only if I get to name the grilled cheese after you. Sometimes, the most honest things begin in silence, over a stove, a cutting board, or a quiet yes. The new space was small, a former bakery tucked in a quiet side street of the South End, its brick facade chipped but charming. The windows were dusty, the floor creaked, and the plumbing needed work. But Grace fell in love with it the second she stepped inside. It smells like burnt sugar, she said, smiling. Nathan leaned against the door frame. Probably from 1992. They walked the length of the narrow dining room together, measuring imaginary tables with steps, marking invisible corners for shelves and herbs. No investors, no backers, just savings, scraped together faith. And the idea of a menu that didn't need to impress anyone just welcomed them. Weeks passed in a blur of paint, paperwork, and imperfect carpentry. Grace discovered Nathan wasn't very good with a hammer, but he was surprisingly precise with tile adhesive. Didn't know you were this domestic, she teased one afternoon as he crouched, smoothing grout with far more focus than necessary. I'm just trying to impress the boss, he said, eyes flicking up. Grace grinned, shook her head, and handed him a sandwich. They built the kitchen together from scratch secondhand stoves, repurposed cutting blocks, hooks for pans made from old piping. Grace chose copper light fixtures. Nathan installed them himself. Every light bulb was crooked. She kept them that way. It gives character, she said. It gives OSHA violations, he muttered. But neither of them cared. On the day they opened, there was no ribbon cutting, no press release, just a handwritten chalkboard out front. Holden and Whitmore. Come in hungry. Come out whole. The first customer was an elderly man who had wandered in looking for the post office. The second was a college student who stayed for 3 hours, writing poetry over butternut squash soup and black coffee. The third was a woman in her 50s who whispered, "I needed a place like this today," and left a $100 tip on a $20 bill. Word spread slowly, not virally, just steadily, like steam rising from a warm bowl of stew. And through it all, Grace and Nathan worked side by side, not as a performance, but as partners. Real ones. One evening, after close, they sat on the back steps, eating leftover sourdough and sipping warm cider. The autumn air had a bite, but they didn't move. Nathan looked out at the empty alley behind them. "You ever think about how this all started?" he asked. "All the time," Grace said. "Do you miss the version where we were just pretending?" She thought for a moment. Sometimes it was simpler, but it wasn't honest. He nodded slowly. "I like honest, even when it's messy." "Especially when it's messy," she corrected. A pause. "Do you still want the restaurant to carry your name?" she asked. He looked at her. "No." She blinked. "I want it to carry yours," he said. "You saved it. You saved me." Grace didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood up, walked inside, and returned with a marker. She walked to the front chalkboard, erased the Whitmore in large looping strokes, and wrote Holden's table. Nathan watched her, quiet. And in that moment, there were no cameras, no stories, no expectations, just two people building something true. That night, before bed, Grace found a folded napkin on the kitchen counter. It read, "Tomorrow's special grilled cheese with too much pepper. No lies, no scripts, just us." She smiled, held it to her chest, and whispered, "Yes." Some of the most important promises don't come in rings or vows. They come in small, quiet moments you choose to stay. It was a Sunday morning, the kind where the air outside was crisp, and the sunlight filtered through the windows like golden silk. Grace stood at the counter of Holden's table, rolling out dough for cinnamon scones, flour dusting her elbows, her nose. She moved with the ease of someone who finally belonged in the space she built not for anyone else, not to prove anything, just because it felt like home. Nathan entered, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. "You missed a spot," he said, tapping her cheek. She smirked, smearing a bit of flour on his shirt in retaliation. "Truce." He handed her the coffee. Always. They moved through the morning in practiced rhythm, opening the blinds, setting the chairs, prepping the pots. Their customers would come in soon, the old man with the book of crossword puzzles, the couple who always split the lemon tart, the woman who said Grace reminded her of her sister. But for now, the place was theirs. Nathan paused, leaned on the counter, watching her. What Grace asked, not looking up. I was just thinking about that day, he said. She looked up. The lobby, he said. You and your busted suitcase. Me and my desperation. Grace laughed. You were a wreck. I was worse than a wreck. I was a man 1 minute away from marrying the wrong life. She wiped her hands on her apron, walked over, and leaned on the counter across from him. And I was a woman trying not to fall apart on a hotel floor, she added. They stood there, facing each other, surrounded by the smell of coffee, cinnamon, and fresh paint. There was nothing elegant about the scene. It was messy, simple, real. Nathan reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, slightly wrinkled napkin. Grace raised an eyebrow. Not another menu idea. Is it? He smiled. No, it's a contract. She laughed, again with the paperwork. But when she took it and unfolded it, she stopped laughing. Written in his handwriting were just 10 words. 3 minutes, every day, no matter what, just us. Grace blinked, her eyes suddenly blurry. No matter how crazy the day gets, Nathan said, gently, we stop. For 3 minutes, no work, no talk about bills, no fixing anything. Just be with each other, like we did at the start. Grace folded the napkin slowly, holding it like something sacred. I can do that, she whispered. Every day, he said. Even when we argue, even when we're tired. 3 minutes, I promise. She stepped around the counter, cupped his face gently. Okay, she said. 3 minutes. He kissed her. Not the kind of kiss you give when the story ends, but the kind you give when the real one begins. That afternoon, a new customer came in young, flustered, dragging a suitcase with a busted wheel. Nathan watched as Grace walked over, smiling warmly, offering water and a seat near the window. The young woman glanced at the menu and looked up. Is the grilled cheese really that good? She asked. Grace smiled. It is, especially the one with too much pepper. Nathan joined her behind the counter, handing her a fresh napkin. 3 minutes, he asked. Grace nodded. And for 3 minutes, the world could wait. Life doesn't always offer second chances wrapped in ribbon. Sometimes, it gives us a stranger with a broken plan and a question we never expected. Through Grace and Nathan's journey, we learn that healing often comes not from grand gestures, but from choosing to show up day by day, minute by minute. Their story reminds us that even after loss, after disappointment, there's still space for something new, something real. In a world full of performance and expectations, the most radical act might be to stop pretending, to be seen, honestly, and to choose someone not because they fit the mold, but because they see your cracks and still stay. For those of us who have lived long enough to know the weight of silence, of sacrifice, of stories we never told, Grace and Nathan's journey is a quiet invitation. It's never too late to begin again. Not with fireworks, but with a promise, even just 3 minutes at a time. And perhaps that's all any of us ever needed. Thank you for spending these quiet moments with us. If this story touched something in you, a memory, a hope, a quiet truth, we'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need it too. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue telling heartfelt stories that heal, connect, and inspire. Until next time, take care of your heart and let it feel.